In the cobblestone streets of medieval Europe, justice was not hidden behind prison walls. It unfolded in the open air, where markets bustled and church bells rang. Here, punishment was a performance, a lesson written on human flesh for everyone to see. To control a restless population, authorities didn't just seek to correct crime. They sought to control the body itself. And nothing sent a clearer message than shame. The body became a stage. Every shackle, every iron collar, every jeering crowd was part of a script designed to remind people who held power and what happened when you stepped out of line. The pain of bruises faded, but the memory of humiliation lingered, reshaping lives long after the sentence ended. Medieval justice relied heavily on spectacle. Instead of removing offenders from society, rulers and church officials put them at its center. The punishment had to be visible, undeniable, and unforgettable. If a thief lost a hand, the crowd learned a lesson. If a woman accused of scolding her husband was dunked repeatedly into freezing water, neighbors whispered, and others thought twice before raising their voices. In an age without mass media, punishment was its own form of propaganda, live, unfiltered, and merciless. But not all punishments were bloody or fatal. In fact, some of the most effective methods were not about breaking bones, but breaking pride. Public shame, carefully staged, worked as a tool of obedience. One common instrument was the pillory, a wooden frame on a post with holes for the head and hands. Criminals were locked in place, exposed to every passerby. People spat, mocked, or hurled rotten food. In some towns, small children were encouraged to pelt offenders with filth, making the lesson a family affair. These punishments didn't only mark the guilty, they bonded the community together against them. To watch was to participate in justice. To laugh at someone in the stocks was to prove you were on the right side of power. The pillory was used for many offenses: cheating in the market, spreading rumors, petty theft. In England, dishonest bakers were placed in it for selling loaves lighter than promised. In France, men who refused military service might find themselves displayed for cowards. The message was universal. The body is yours, but your honor belongs to us. Humiliation wasn't limited to men. In fact, women were often targeted for punishments tailored to their supposed weaknesses or social roles. The scold's bridle was one such device, an iron cage locked around the head, with a metal plate to press down on the tongue. Women accused of gossiping or quarreling could be paraded through the streets, silenced by force, a living warning that certain voices were not welcome in public life. Another device was the cucking stool or ducking chair. Accused of being a scold, a cheat, or even of minor moral failings, women were strapped into a wooden chair attached to a long beam and dunked into a river or pond. Crowds gathered to laugh, and the cold water shocked body and spirit alike. It was a punishment that made the victim literally sink beneath the weight of communal judgment. These practices reveal an important truth. Shame was not accidental. It was designed. Medieval authorities understood that the fear of disgrace could control people as effectively as the threat of physical pain. Losing face in front of neighbors, friends, or family could destroy reputations and limit opportunities for life. A man might recover from a beating, but how could he recover from being mocked as a liar or a coward every time he walked through town? And unlike a sword stroke, humiliation didn't require great expense. A pillory was cheaper than a gallows. A bridle cost less than a soldier's wages. Justice on display was economical and efficient, and that made it deeply appealing to rulers and local officials. The church also used these tools. In a deeply religious age, sin was seen not only as a spiritual failing but as a social danger. Adulterers, blasphemers, and Sabbath breakers might be forced to walk barefoot through the streets, wearing signs describing their crimes, or dressed in special garments to mark their disgrace. A man who missed Mass might carry a candle of penance through town. A woman who broke moral rules might be made to stand at the church door while her neighbors filed past. These punishments blurred the line between religion and law. Moral offenses became crimes. The body, marked and shamed, became a sermon everyone could see. The message was not simply "do not steal" or "do not lie." It was "obey, or we will strip you of your dignity." At times, the punishments were chillingly creative. In German towns, the drunkard's cloak made offenders wear a heavy barrel with holes for arms and head, forcing them to stumble through the streets while onlookers jeered. In the Netherlands, dishonest traders might be nailed by the ear to a post and forced to tear themselves free as a crowd watched. In Italy, gamblers caught cheating had to parade naked or half-dressed through the piazza, holding their dice as a confession in hand. But there was more than cruelty at work. These punishments reflected a worldview in which the body was a mirror of the soul, and shame could purify as much as pain. To degrade someone in public was not just to hurt them, but to cleanse them in the eyes of society. The belief was that disgrace could drive sinners back toward obedience, humility, and faith. It's easy to see these methods as barbaric relics, yet they were rooted in a practical logic. Authorities needed to enforce order in crowded towns, where tempers flared and disputes multiplied. With few professional police and limited prisons, swift and memorable punishments kept people in line. Fear of disgrace became a leash around the neck of the poor and powerless, pulling them where rulers wanted them to go. Still, the punishments didn't always work as intended. Some people used them to turn shame into defiance. A thief in the pillory might shout jokes at the crowd, winning applause instead of scorn. A woman in a scold's bridle might glare at her accusers until they fell silent. In rare cases, sympathy for the punished led to riots against officials, proving that public shame was never entirely controllable. Even so, the strategy endured for centuries. It was simple, cheap, and visible. It reinforced not only laws, but social hierarchies. Men over women, church over laity, rich over poor. The body became a billboard announcing guilt, and humiliation a currency of power. By the late Middle Ages, towns were filled with these devices. Pillories in marketplaces, whipping posts at crossroads, bridles hanging in city halls as silent threats. They were part of the landscape, as ordinary as fountains or wells. Children grew up watching them in use, learning early that the public eye was a weapon. In this world, control of the body was control of the person. To bend the neck, to clamp the jaw, to display a man's face like an exhibit. These were ways of ruling without raising an army. Shame kept people obedient not because it hurt, but because it followed them home. Across medieval Europe, punishment of the body was never only about pain. It was about theater. In cities from London to Lubeck, Bruges to Bologna, magistrates transformed squares into stages, where criminals were not merely disciplined, they were displayed. The message was unmistakable. This body belongs to authority, not to itself. The pillory stood at the center of this performance. Unlike the stocks, which confined the legs, the pillory locked the head and hands in a wooden frame. Victims were forced upright, unable to shield their faces from the stares, jeers, or flying refuse of neighbors. The crime might be minor: a baker selling underweight bread, a man spreading rumors, a woman accused of public drunkenness. But the punishment was personal. Townspeople were expected to participate, hurling insults or even rotten food. It was a civic duty to humiliate, a form of crowd justice sanctified by law. What made the pillory powerful was its paradox. It did not simply isolate the offender. It exposed them, embedding their disgrace into the memory of the community. A fine could be paid in private. A flogging could leave scars hidden under clothes. But an hour in the pillory marked you before every eye that mattered. Your neighbors knew your face. They saw you bend beneath authority. And they would not forget. Other punishments were even more theatrical. Take the practice of parading offenders through the streets, often half-dressed, forced to carry symbols of their crime. A cheating merchant might be marched with a counterfeit coin hung around his neck. A dishonest miller could be led with flour dusted over his head, as though the crime itself had spilled onto his body. For women accused of scolding or gossip, the dreaded cucking stool awaited, a humiliating dunk in a river or pond, meant to silence the unruly tongue. The splash was a warning, not just to the woman, but to every onlooker. This is what happens when words defy the order of things. Public nudity, too, was sometimes used not for lust, but for degradation. Stripped of garments, an offender was stripped of status, of dignity, of protection from the eyes of the crowd. Medieval culture regarded the body as a reflection of the soul. To lay it bare was to proclaim spiritual unworthiness. This tactic was often reserved for those accused of moral crimes, adultery, prostitution, or blasphemy, where exposure was intended to match alleged offense with visible shame. Such punishments blurred the line between justice and spectacle. City authorities relied on them because they were cheap, memorable, and deeply symbolic. They required no prison infrastructure, no professional guards, only wood, rope, and a willing audience. And that audience rarely disappointed. A punishment in silence would fail its purpose. The crowd's laughter, anger, or stones were part of the sentence itself. We should not imagine, however, that everyone accepted these rituals of shame without question. In some places, especially by the later Middle Ages, there was unease about how much power humiliation gave to the mob. A punishment designed to correct could turn into an act of vengeance. In London in the 15th century, chroniclers record moments when pillory victims were pelted not just with filth, but with stones and bones sharp enough to wound or kill. What began as civic theater sometimes slipped into civic murder. Authorities occasionally intervened, ordering guards to protect prisoners, not out of mercy, but to keep control over the spectacle. Punishment had to belong to the law, not to the fury of the crowd. Gender shaped everything. Women were punished differently from men, not only in what they endured, but in how the punishments were imagined. A drunken man in the pillory was mocked for his behavior. A drunken woman in the pillory was mocked for daring to be visible at all. Female offenders risked not only legal penalties, but social ruin in a culture that judged women's bodies as repositories of family honor. To make a woman's disgrace public was to scar her entire household. This is why authorities often targeted women accused of so-called immoral behavior with punishments that emphasized exposure, silence, and control. Gossiping wives were fastened into iron bridles, scold's bridles, with a metal bit clamped in the mouth, to parade their enforced silence through the streets. Alleged adulteresses might be marched barefoot, hair loose, forced to confess before churches and marketplaces. These were not simply legal penalties. They were lessons in obedience, etched into flesh and memory. There was also the matter of symbolism. Medieval Europe loved to make crime visible through the body. If a baker cheated customers, he might be forced to carry his own loaves in public, sometimes hung around his neck like a heavy yoke. If a thief stole cloth, he could be paraded in a tunic sewn from the stolen goods, literally wearing his crime. This logic reached cruel extremes. Branding criminals with hot irons, carving letters of shame into their skin, or slicing ears and noses to create permanent marks. Such punishments made the body itself into a living record, a walking proclamation of guilt. And yet, these methods were not random acts of cruelty. They were rooted in medieval ideas about order, morality, and divine justice. Punishing the body was thought to heal the soul. Humiliating the offender was thought to protect the community by warning others. The pain and spectacle were not byproducts, they were the very point. The law sought not merely to correct behavior but to dramatize the power of authority, to make the invisible visible. Even the smallest details mattered. A thief paraded on market day reached the largest possible audience. A woman ducked in winter's icy water was not just shamed, but chilled to the bone, her trembling body amplifying the lesson. In some towns, musicians accompanied the march of offenders with mocking tunes. In others, officials wrote out proclamations to read aloud, making sure no one missed the reason for the punishment. These were moral performances, carefully staged to etch fear and obedience into the hearts of every bystander. The medieval public understood these signals well. When the bell rang or the crier shouted, people gathered eagerly. They watched not with detached curiosity but with moral judgment. To witness punishment was to reaffirm one's own place in the social order. You were not the one in the pillory. You were not the one marched half-naked through the mud. And by participating, by laughing, shouting, or throwing refuse, you proved yourself loyal to the same authority that might punish you tomorrow. But there was another, quieter consequence. When punishments became too brutal, too humiliating, they sometimes backfired. A victim who bore his suffering with courage could earn admiration. A woman who endured her ducking with dignity could stir sympathy. If the crowd turned from laughter to pity, the theater of shame lost its edge. Medieval authorities understood this danger. Punishment had to be harsh enough to terrify, yet not so harsh that it created martyrs. Finding that balance was never easy. Even as the Middle Ages waned, the lessons of bodily punishment and public humiliation lingered. Cities evolved, courts modernized, and prisons became more common. But the theater of shame remained a potent tool. Authorities discovered that the fear of public exposure often worked as well or better than physical punishment. A fine or a short imprisonment carried weight only if it was visible, if the community could measure it. And so the logic of the pillory, the stocks, and the public parade continued to shape ideas about crime, morality, and control well into the early modern period. In many ways, shame was more enduring than scars. A branded letter might fade or an iron shackle might rust, but a reputation could last a lifetime. Gossip traveled faster than punishment, and human memory extended punishment beyond the square and into the everyday lives of neighbors. Families carried the mark of disgrace. Marriages were delayed, inheritances challenged, social mobility curtailed. A crime against the moral order became a stigma, invisible but heavy, following the offender like a shadow. This use of shame as a weapon highlights a broader truth about medieval society. Control was often more psychological than physical. Authorities understood that fear, ridicule, and public exposure were powerful tools. Pain alone might correct behavior temporarily, but shame reshaped identity. To be humiliated in the eyes of the community was to be reminded constantly of your dependence on law and order. It was a way of teaching compliance without always resorting to the sword, the whip, or the stocks. Surprisingly, some offenders found ways to resist even these tightly controlled rituals. They turned humiliation into performance, meeting jeers with bold expressions or clever remarks. There are accounts of thieves who made jokes about their stolen goods, women who addressed the crowd with wit while standing on the cucking stool, men who sang defiant songs from the pillory. In doing so, they shifted the audience's attention, momentarily reclaiming power from those who sought to humiliate them. The crowd's laughter, intended as punishment, sometimes became admiration. These small acts of defiance demonstrate that shame, while potent, was never absolute. Yet the system relied on subtle, calculated cruelty. A shamed body was a lesson not just for the offender but for everyone else. Merchants, children, neighbors, and bystanders all learned the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Moral norms were enforced through collective witnessing, and the punishment extended beyond the moment. Public humiliation created a spectacle of morality that was both feared and internalized, binding communities with shared rules of conduct. The gendered dimension of these punishments cannot be overstated. Women's bodies were treated as repositories of moral authority, and offenses against public order often translated into attacks on female dignity. Women accused of slander, theft, or sexual transgression faced punishments designed to silence, expose, and degrade. Their shame was meant to resonate not only with themselves but with their families, who were also implicated in the offense. Male offenders faced public exposure too, but it was the alignment of female bodies with virtue and household reputation that magnified the stakes. Religious authorities also wielded shame as a spiritual corrective. Penitential rituals often involved public confession, wearing signs of sin, or walking barefoot to the local church. Monastic communities sometimes forced monks and nuns to endure humiliation as a reminder of humility and obedience. These practices illustrate the continuity between secular and religious applications of shame. Both sought to control behavior through public scrutiny, embedding moral lessons into the fabric of daily life. Even today, the echoes of these practices resonate. Modern societies may no longer drag offenders through market squares or lock them in pillories, but the principles remain. Social media, viral videos, and online shaming are digital descendants of medieval spectacles. Humiliation is still a tool of control, capable of reshaping reputations, influencing behavior, and reinforcing social norms. The lessons are timeless. Shame, when public and performative, wields power over both body and mind. In studying these practices, we gain more than just historical curiosity. We understand how societies manipulate morality, how public scrutiny enforces compliance, and how the human desire to regulate behavior through shame is ancient. Medieval punishments teach us that the body has long been a canvas for authority, painted with lessons of obedience, virtue, and fear. The spectacle of humiliation was designed to leave no part of the self untouched, physical, social, and moral, all woven into a single act of control. Perhaps the most chilling aspect is the universality of this method. Across towns, regions, and even centuries, shame worked as a discipline accessible to every community. You did not need wealth, a castle, or an army, just witnesses. The community became the enforcer. Laughter, jeers, and collective judgment were sufficient to remind individuals of their place. The lesson was internalized without chains, without scars, without blood. To live openly in society was to accept that your actions could be displayed, dissected, and judged. So when we look back at the streets of medieval towns, at the pillories and cucking stools, the public shaming of adulterers and thieves, we see more than cruelty. We see a society meticulously crafting behavioral boundaries, using the body as both messenger and canvas. Pain was temporary. Shame was enduring. And the echo of those lessons reverberates even now, reminding us that the power of public judgment is as old as human community itself. Ultimately, medieval punishments were about control over bodies, over morals, over communities. They were not random acts of cruelty but calculated strategies designed to instill obedience, reinforce social hierarchies, and communicate the consequences of transgression. By forcing individuals into public shame, authorities shaped not only their behavior but their identity, turning the private human self into a public moral lesson. And while the pillory, stocks, and cucking stool have long vanished from city squares, their legacy endures. The human fascination with public exposure, the use of shame to enforce rules, and the subtle interplay between suffering and spectacle continue to shape societies today. In studying the methods of the past, we uncover the roots of a profound truth. Control through humiliation is not merely historical. It is enduring, powerful, and deeply human. The streets may no longer echo with the cries of those trapped in wooden frames, but the lessons of medieval shame remain, whispering through history. They remind us that the body, the community, and the eyes of others have always been instruments of control. And in understanding these echoes of the dark era, we glimpse the delicate, sometimes terrifying, balance between order and cruelty, morality and spectacle, authority and the human spirit.